British Columbia announced that the U.S. government has paused negotiations on the expansive Columbia River Treaty, saying the current administration is reviewing its international engagements. Now, the treaty is decades old. It regulates a number of ways in which the Columbia River is used, including flood control, power generation, and water supply. The river's headwaters are in British Columbia, but it flows into the state of Washington as well as Oregon. Last July, in an in-principle deal on an updated version of that treaty, they were reached by Canada and the United States, but it was not finalized before Donald Trump took office. In a recent phone call with the former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Trump called the treaty unfair to the United States. Okay. So that is a lot to take in. Why don't we break down that very latest thing that we talked about? Joining us now to better understand what's going on with the water treaties between Canada and the United States is Tricia Stadnik. She's a professor and Canada Research Chair in Hydrologic Modeling with the University of Calgary's Schulich School of Engineering and Department of Geography. Oh my gosh, that's a lot too. Professor, thank you so much for making time for us today.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
So there's so much to unpack when it comes to Canada and the Americans and our relationship around water, but let's begin with the Columbia Water Treaty. What's going on here? What's gone wrong here?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's suffering from bad timing in a way. The treaty was reopened for negotiations in 2018, actually, during the last Trump administration, and negotiations have been ongoing ever since. In mid-2024, the negotiators reached an agreement, and it took until about December of 2024 to fully agree on the exact terms and nature that were going to be written down, which unfortunately did not leave enough time for the agreement to be ratified in Congress before the new administration took over in the U.S.
And, okay, so then what does that mean right now?
So the agreement is still in place and it is still holding at this point, but pausing negotiations on this agreement means that at this point, there isn't a mechanism to proceed to actually ratifying it into law to make it a treaty, which means that it's informal at best. And certainly the U.S. pausing negotiations is raising eyebrows a little bit in terms of whether or not it will actually make it to U.S. Congress in order to be brought into law. So although each party on each side right now is adhering to it, the question is for how long can this be maintained?
This has brought up the larger issue of water, Canada's sovereignty, and President Trump's interest in our water supply. I was just listening to a piece by the New York Times earlier in the week where it seems that, according to their reporting, there was one of the last conversations between President Trump and then Prime Minister Trudeau, that Trump said Canada has too much water and it's unfair and that the Americans need more access to it, which leads into this ongoing discussion about Canada's sovereignty. Give me a sense of how this is all being perceived.
Yeah, so I think there is a real difference between what is being said by the political leaders in a more heated context and what is actually happening on the ground. That said, this is not a new debate in some ways. You know, there's a long history of the U.S. having interest in Canada's water resources that dates back long before we have the current laws in place. And in fact, there was agreements back in the 1940s with discussions in the U.S. Congress in order to divert water, massive amounts of water from Canada to the U.S. We had this through the 80s and 90s with the Great Lakes. And now, once again, here we are. Water is not part of NAFTA officially, but that has been contested. And so this whole rhetoric and talk around tariffs right now begs the question, along with Donald Trump openly contesting the boundary treaty, which is in fact defined, the boundary between Canada and the U.S. is actually defined in the Waters Treaty. That was the first time that it was actually surveyed. So it does beg the question as to whether there is some interest by the U.S. in bringing water, Canadian water specifically, and transboundary water into tariff talk and into NAFTA again.
Can you put this all into layman's terms for us, Professor? What does this mean? Is our access to our water in threat right now?
Yes, I would say in large part, you know, Canadians need to understand that Just like being Canadian is a large part of our identity and being sovereign is a part of our identity, having water and our access to water and resources is a large part of our identity too. And I think because of that, Canadians oftentimes don't think about the fact that water flows across the border and is in fact something that can be contested by the US in terms of where that border exists and whose water is whose. And I would say that here in Canada right now, with our current laws and governance around water, we're ill prepared to deal with the threats that would come at us from a US administration. And the main reason I say that is because in our Water Act, water is actually defined as being owned by the provinces and the territories in Canada, which means that it's largely the responsibility of each individual province and territory to defend and form treaties with the United States. So it is not actually handled at the federal level by the Canadian government at this point.
And when you say defend, how exactly are you picturing defense?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not talking about boots on the ground at this point, let's hope. I'm really talking about economically and also as a resource. So the US has made it very clear that the main motivation for a lot of this tariff talk, particularly recently, is economically driven. And, you know, economics for them not only encompasses having access to resources such as water, but many of the rivers that cross the Canada-U.S. boundary are used for hydropower production. So that's an energy-based resource. And we know this administration is extremely focused on creating better and cheaper access to energy in the United States. And part of that comes from water that is generated, in the case of the Columbia River Treaty, from water that is stored on the Canadian side and promised to the U.S., almost like a battery in a way, in a cell phone. Canada stores the water, and then the U.S. can use that to generate hydropower on the American side.
Professor Stadnik, what seems troubling to me, based on what you're telling us, is that, for example, when this current American administration says that they're imposing the tariffs for national security reasons with this allegation of fentanyl streaming through Canada, even though the evidence indicates that that is not in fact the case, and Canada is fighting this legally under international law. But it seems that the Americans do have a pretty valid case on the waterfront because we haven't necessarily bolstered up our laws to protect what happens to be in our geographic region, which is the water. So what do you think needs to happen, and what do you think is likely going to happen with this American administration?
That's a fantastic question. And I agree with you entirely that really what we need to do is put water on the radar. We need to not assume that our water is our water. There's lots of things that are being contested right now, lots of different international laws and treaties that are far more sound than some of our boundary waters treaties and other things governing water. So what needs to happen, first and foremost, is we need to have a federal strategy. I'm not talking about taking power away from provinces and territories, but really we need to work together at all levels of government to be prepared to respond to very real threats over our natural resources, not the least of which is including water. The second thing that needs to happen is we need to look at all of the issues from the U.S. around the Columbia River Treaty as not just the Columbia River, which is on the West Coast and out of a lot of Canadians' minds, but very much connected to the Great Lakes and all of the agreements that we have in place for all 13 river basins and lakes that span the Canada-U.S. border. And the third thing is for Canadians just to understand a little bit more that the water that we have should not be taken for granted. It should not be assumed that the way the border is defined and the way in which the water originates in Canada right now, in many of the cases, will always be that case. We need to make sure that we're ready and prepared to deal with whatever can come at us, including the long history of wanting to embed water as a trade negotiation between Canada and the U.S.
Okay, we'll definitely keep our eye on this story. Professor Tricia Stadnik, thank you so much for your time and for your insights.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure.